There's this concept called rabbit starvation, and I always thought it was rabid starvation, which I think is a much cooler name. But if you just eat amino acids, I'm honestly not exactly confident on exactly what happens, but basically you can physically die from eating too much protein. It might be due to too much nitrogen accumulating in your bloodstream, which is like what makes a protein, nitrogen. But even on keto diets, you're supposed to keep protein like relatively low. I think it's like 20 to 30%. You're supposed to mostly be consuming fat because you can physically die from the excess consumption of amino acids. Now, that's at a...
This week, I interviewed online fitness coach and podcast host Tyler Woodward. We discussed Tyler's pro-metabolic perspective from how he came from a keto and fasting background. We also touched on ways to increase your metabolism, advantage of eating carbs for energy, Tyler's eating routine, his top testosterone boosting activities, and his one tip to get your body back to what it once was. Really enjoyed my interview with Tyler. I know you will too. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Gryn, and I have Tyler Woodward on. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on all the way from Denver.
Yes, sir.
Got your ski goggles behind you. If you're watching on YouTube, you got your, are you going skiing today or snowboarding? Yeah.
I will not be snowboarding today. Got to work today, but maybe one day this week. We'll see.
Do you have like ski in, ski out? That would be really cool.
No. Okay. That would be cool. I would probably be skiing today if I had ski in, ski out, but the mountains are about an hour and a half from Denver. So very doable, but not ski in, ski out, sadly.
Yeah, that would be just like too irresistible to just get out there every day.
My podcast studio would look a lot cooler if I was ski in, ski out.
Yeah. Speaking of that, you have a podcast, Recommended Daily Value.
Yeah.
And you had another one, I know, an older one, and then you started this one how long ago?
So I actually started this one when I was at my old company. So it's been going for about 2 years, on and off. It's changed themes a couple times. Had a couple rough patches, as I'm sure you've been aware, but I'll get back to it probably the next few weeks, picking up consistency. And that's one of my goals for this year, to be more consistent with social media and the podcasting.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing about a podcast is, if you let it go for a little bit, you can always come back to it, right?
Yeah.
Usually the listeners will come back and the people will find you that really want to listen. And I've actually heard you on the Strong Sisters podcast because I've had Ashley on before, and in your other podcasts you've had Georgie Dinkoff on, some similar guests that I've had on mine. And part of the reason I wanted to get you on is I've had Jay Feldman on as well, Danny Roddy. We've had quite a bit of pro-metabolic on this podcast. And initially when I first started a podcast, I didn't even know about the whole pro-metabolic space, but I think first I might have had Jay on, who was introduced me to someone else, and Brad Kearns. I don't know if you're familiar with Brad Kearns.
Yeah. He's the keto guy, isn't he?
He was, not much anymore. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He's one that introduced me to Jay. So Brad has the B.rad podcast. And anyways, we all sort of lead to each other, but maybe explain to the audience. I know you do coaching. You're big into biomechanics, but also have gotten into pro-metabolic. How did this sort of come into your life?
Yeah, sure. So I consider myself a meathead first, part facetiously. I was really into lifting, wanted to be bigger. As you can obviously tell, I'm huge. No, I'm just kidding. Still in that journey, but I really wasn't seeing any muscle growth in the gym. And so I started, at first I was ironically very anti-supplements, thought you don't need them, they're crap. Got really into supplements in pursuit of testosterone optimization. And that led me to Christopher Walker, who I worked under for a few years. And then through him and my former boss, Jayden Miller, was introduced to Ray Peat. And I have a degree in physiology and neurobiology, so it kind of all pans out. I was learning about endocrinology, all of the hormones and systems. And I think a lot of these things are tied together. If you have really low testosterone levels, you're not going to see a lot of results in the gym. You're also not going to feel very good. So the pro-metabolic way of eating was kind of my gateway to hopefully getting better muscle growth in the gym.
Interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I'm just kind of into like I'm kind of a nerd. So like figuring out all the pieces together and saying like, okay, like this makes sense, add this in. I think having that holistic view is very useful.
What were you doing before you got into sort of the pro-metabolic space? What were you trying before? Yeah.
So diet wise, I was doing intermittent fasting pretty religiously. Big on intermittent fasting, thought it was the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How long did you do that? Because I did it. I started doing it for myself and then using it with clients. Gosh, I have a journal. Here it is. 2017. Okay. At like the intermittent fasting journal. And the thing about it is like if you talk to most people in the health space, they've changed their minds about things, or they've gone in different directions. And this is all like self-experimentation too. I do think fasting can maybe play a role in some people's lives. I think it's not a bad tool to have or to use from time to time. If you're on an airplane and there's just shitty food, it's like, okay, like I've done this before. I don't need to eat, right? Like, but I like anything, myself included, like can overdo things. And
Yeah, for
that's where you
sure.
can see sort of the downfall of maybe what you don't want to see in health, which is, not optimizing your hormones correctly. But anyways, go back into that. You were talking, you did some fasting.
Yeah, I was doing intermittent fasting for about 6 years, and it was pretty intense because at the time there was one summer where I was lifting in the morning, landscaping all day
Mm,
because I was in college, needed a job for the summer,
hmm
and then came home and ate, and then went to jiu-jitsu. So it was just like
mm,
8 hours of really intense physical labor while fasting. I was probably not in the best mood most of the time,
mm,
but at the time you feel great because
right.
you're running on some crazy hormones and you don't feel hungry, and you just tell everyone your autophagy and all that stuff. You're cleaning your cells. And that was really the extent. I wasn't eating particularly healthy in college, just trying to get by, hey, get my protein in. And then once I graduated, I really went pretty hardcore into the Ray Pete style
Mm.
of things, which has made some mistakes there as well, but led me to where I'm at right now, which I think is a more not extreme view in diet. At least I would consider it. Some people would think we're nuts. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, learning about the Ray Pete, I don't want to call it like style of eating. He was a researcher, right? Like, I think people think there's like a Ray Pete diet. Maybe give people, people pretty much know what intermittent fasting is to some degree, right? You're pretty
yeah.
much just abstaining from food for a time period, which I think is, like I said, I think it's a tool to have. Like one thing I have kept up from my fasting days is I don't eat after a certain hour. I just prefer not to eat late. I think it just disrupts my sleep, and I'm just not digesting the food correctly. So I really try to cut off about 3 hours before bed. That's something that that's like a hard rule for myself and a lot of clients I work with that on that. But beyond that, maybe perhaps touch on what the whole pro-metabolic space is about and what people can learn from that.
Yeah. So the whole pro-metabolic space kind of founded by Dr. Ray Pete. Whether or not he made want to do that intentionally, I think is probably up for debate, but there's a huge following nowadays. And the idea is to kind of increase your metabolic rate. So the rate at which you can produce energy. Kathleen Stewart has talked a bunch about this with the Ashley and Sarah and on my podcast as well. And she's great if anyone wants to go follow her. We have a kind of a metabolic range. So Tyler, at the same weight, same activity level, can burn, let's say, 3,000 to 4,000 calories. And that's not me exercising more. That is just my metabolism, which you could define metabolism as the amount of chemical reactions that are occurring in your body on a day to day or minute to minute basis that allow you to function. So, metabolism is essentially made up of four parts: your basal metabolic rate. That's if you were laid in bed all day and didn't move. That is the biggest chunk of your metabolism, the biggest chunk of the amount of energy that you burn. It's about 60 to 70%. Then you have NEAT, which is, talking right now, moving your hands, exercise. Everyone knows what exercise is, and the thermic effect of food, which is basically the cost of digestion. And the big thing for me is that basal metabolic rate, as she said, or as I've said previously, has a huge window which you can be. So you can upregulate and downregulate your metabolism based on the inputs, which could be, toxins, things in your food. Could also mean the right amount and right quantity of food, the types of food you're eating, which can allow you to increase or decrease your metabolic rate. And Repeat was all about figuring out ways to increase the metabolic rate.
Yeah, great explanation. So you got four avenues there regarding metabolism. The BMR, right, which is, would you say 70% of your
Yeah,
metabolic
I think
rate?
I think 65 is about where it's
65.
estimated to be.
Okay. And then you got non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just like the things like fidgeting and the things you're doing outside of exercise. Then you also have exercise, which is probably what is a small percentage of your metabolic rate, right? Is it
Yeah, it's like
10%?
10%. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And then the thermic effect of food, which is that about 10%, give or take, or
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, because you hear a lot of times like protein has the highest thermic effect. Perhaps maybe explain a little bit about that. I've talked about that in videos, but maybe, just so people can understand that.
Yeah. So it's just the cost of digestion. So
Right.
if you eat a lot of protein, your core body temperature will raise, which basically means it's working harder to digest that food. So compare fat and carbs almost require very, very little energy, where it's almost irrelevant. But also I would say the thermic effect of food is also almost irrelevant because it's such like even if you increase 10% of your, so let's say thermic effective food is about 10%, if you increase that by 1% or even 5%, it's just like, almost immeasurable.
Right.
So it is a component, a somewhat significant component, 10% of how many calories you burn on a day-to-day basis, but it's not really like eating a ton of protein isn't going to increase your metabolic rate. And it's kind of like when people are talking about, there is this concept of flux, which is just eat more, move more, which I think I'm all here for. But when you're talking about increasing your metabolism, that's not really what we're talking about. And I think you should approach it from both ways. Eating a ton of protein just is not going to do much for your metabolism. It's just going to give you a lot more protein. And at some point, there's a very diminishing return to more protein. I think the repeat style people sometimes lean on the lower end, probably in the moderate end of around 0.82 grams per pound, or you could, yeah, probably around there for maximizing muscle growth, which is kind of where I orient myself towards. But 1 gram per pound, 2 gram per pound, you're just burning a ton more amino acids. And that is a little bit more stressful of a pathway to get energy. And it doesn't really come at any additional benefit. So you have, get some more carbs in. And the carbs, at least at some level, seem to reduce the rate at which you burn amino acids. So basically, there's a protein, what's the word?
Protein sparing that
No,
or
thank you.
no?
Protein sparing effect of carbs. So
Okay.
the more protein you burn, the more carbs you eat and burn, the less protein you'll burn for energy.
And people might be listening there, and maybe they're more on the high protein, like almost like carnivore-ish type diets. What would you say to them as far as the advantages of slowly implementing, quality carbohydrates into your routine? How can that help? And I know you talked about it a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, number one, it's a little expensive on the budget because protein is by far
Oh,
pound for pound
right.
the most expensive food.
Yeah, true.
And then I think you will just end up getting a lot more energy from digesting carbs. Now, the thing is, you have to take it slow. A lot of people that go from carnivore or keto to pro-metabolic, they just add in carbs, and you have just spent X amount of years training your body to be a fat burner, which means inherently you're training your body to be not good at burning carbs. So if you just add in 1,000 calories of carbs and then you gain a ton of weight and you're like, I went pro-metabolic, I gained a ton of weight. It's like, well,
Is
it's
that
like
is that the mistake you made?
I just so I wasn't like low carb or keto. I just gained a ton of weight in I added a ton of whole milk, and I added a ton of milk period, and I just was kind of like bulking
Mm.
and was like, oh, it's muscle growth, but I was just kind of dirty bulking and should have taken a much more slower approach to really maximize muscle growth. And then I got pretty chunky monkey and I cut a bunch of weight, but I was doing it intentionally. I was doing bulks and cuts kind of like a bodybuilder, no longer really an advocate of that, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And I was not the brightest of the bunch at the time.
You've matured.
So they say. We'll see.
So let's go back to that. So you were saying, carbohydrates as an energy source is a lot more efficient, right?
Mhm.
For your body to use that. And also, if you're just used to burning fat and using that as a fuel source, that's more of an inefficient fuel source. Perhaps maybe explain a little bit about that to people so they can understand.
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting thing that I picked up from Kyle Moonis. And I think almost everyone agrees at this point that MCTs, like the things found in coconut oil, are
Hmm.
like mitochondrial fuel, like they're like really fast burning. And the reason that is because they are closer to glucose or they're closer to carbohydrates in structure due to the ratio of carbon to oxygen. So if you look at glucose, which is like the essential carbohydrate, right? It's C6, 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And fats, maybe we can put a structure of fatty acid on the screen at some point, but
Okay.
basically it's a carbon hydrogen chain. So there's no oxygens in it. And basically what that means is glucose and sugars bring their own oxygen with them to the party. So they're much easier to burn. Whereas the longer of a chain of fatty acids, you get less oxygen. So you need to bring more in. That also the big thing largely, and there's a number of ways this happens, but one of the bigger things is that with burning glucose or carbs, you create more carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is not just this waste product that we've often been taught to believe. There's this process called the Bohr-Haldane effect, which basically means that hemoglobin, the molecule that brings your red blood cells to your cells to deliver oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and then brings it back out to your lungs to release the carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen, changes in shape based on the acidity of the environment. So it's kind of like being a catcher and a pitcher. So when it's really acidic in your muscles, it will change shape to let go of the oxygen to deliver that to the tissues and pick up carbon dioxide. And vice versa, when it's not so acidic in your lungs, it will change shape to pick up oxygen and let go of that carbon dioxide. The humdinger about the Bohr-Haldane effect is that the more acidic you get, so the more CO2 that's produced, the more CO2 the hemoglobin will drop off, and therefore the more oxygen will pick up. So it's this endless feedback cycle, not endless, but it's this feedback cycle where the better your mitochondria work by producing more CO2, the more oxygen they'll absorb, and then the more they'll work. And then it also has some CO2 has some vasodilation properties, which means you're getting more blood flow to the tissues, which means there's more oxygen coming in, which means your cells burn more energy, and the cycle goes on and on and on.
So in layman terms,
Okay,
so
in
people,
layman
yeah, go
in
ahead.
layman terms, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, yeah, go ahead.
In layman terms, the carbs allow your body to burn energy at a faster rate and probably through a much more cleaner cycle. You would kind of imagine like fats having a little bit more soot. And this isn't like a perfect analogy by any means. I'll probably have some people really angry at me for saying this, but the carbs are just kind of like perfectly clean energy, and the fat has a little bit more debris. It's not as smooth, not as clean.
And and what would you say to people that are just eating protein? How can
Oh,
that can
yes.
sort of take a toll? Yeah,
Yeah, so there's this concept called rabbit starvation, and I always thought it was rabid starvation, which I
that's
think is
it.
a much cooler name. But if you just eat amino acids, your body like your I'm honestly not exactly confident on exactly what happens, but basically you can physically die from eating too much protein. It might be due to too much nitrogen accumulating in your bloodstream, which is like what makes a protein, nitrogen. But even on keto diets, you're supposed to keep protein like relatively low. I think it's like 20 to 30%. You're supposed to mostly be consuming fat because you can physically die from the excess consumption of amino acids. Now, that's at a very extreme point.
Extreme. Yeah,
Yeah, I just think there's generally diminishing return. Proteins, again, really expensive, really hard to digest, and you will probably feel a lot better eating some carbs with it. Now, again, if you were keto and intermittent fasting the last 20 years and then you just add in a bunch of carbs, you're probably going to feel like crap,
right.
but doing it slowly over time.
Yeah, and I know you talked to Kathleen about that, and she really talked about how like you really want to slowly. I think she said 5 to 50 calories or carb or calories like a week. Does that
Yeah.
sound about right?
Yeah. We're currently working with a bunch of people and transitioning their macros, and we're removing about 3 grams of fat per week and then adding, depending on the person, 2 grams of protein and 3 grams of carbs. So, like, even out the calories. So, just very, very slowly transitioning them down. Most people, or a lot of people, don't get enough protein. Some people are obviously get too much. But yeah, a few grams a week of protein to carbs or fat to carbs is how we would probably approach that, or she would approach that.
Okay. And so where do you so okay, so if someone's going to implement, they'll just slowly do it over time and maybe cut whatever other macronutrient or protein or fat down slightly. Obviously, like you said, you don't want to, I think like a balanced approach is the best way to go, but getting to that point just takes time.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely do it overnight. It's just you will probably not feel so good. Could, which we've all kind of done those things where it's like I'm going. No one goes keto in like a few weeks, right? So it's just like I'm cutting out all carbs.
Right. Yeah. And so what with your clients, is this a common thing that you run across a lot of the people that you work with? I know you and Ashley have started up like a coaching service, right?
Yeah. So Kathleen, Ashley, and I have all started a program
Oh,
called Transform. Yeah.
oh, nice. Kathleen's involved too.
Yeah. So basically, a lot of the people in general population, most people we find just eat way too much fat. But
Interesting.
yeah, for the average or a lot of our community, which is very niche, that's a lot of women coming over from keto and low carb, and they just started eating a ton of fat, and then they sometimes phased in some carbs, and they didn't do it very slowly, so they gained a ton of weight. And we're just kind of helping them find a good spot and trying to build their maintenance calories, as you said, 5 to 50 calories a week.
I mean, do you have women coming to you that literally, and men perhaps, but like eating like 1,000 calories, and they've probably been doing it for like 20 years?
Some It's really interesting because there's this whole concept of measurement as the intervention. So when you start weighing yourself every day, you no longer eat the donut or opt for McDonald's. You change your behavior as a result of just measuring. So it's hard to say. There are some people that are eating 1,000. There's a handful, and it's really hard to believe. I'm just like, I kind of want to see if they continue to eat this way, or they just like go. What we tend to see is a lot of people don't eat a lot, and then on weekends they go to town.
Mm.
So they're in this, as Kathleen would call it, like the weekly LEA, low energy availability state. So they starve themselves kind of during the week and they eat a ton during the weekend. And when I say starve yourselves, I mean like in a calorie deficit. The calorie deficit is really just a forced starvation, right?
And I feel like those people, though, they're so used to eating in this low energy availability state that it's just become norm for them,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm thinking of my wife particularly, who probably eats one meal a day, and it's
Yeah.
like how much is she? She's a small. How much is she actually getting in that meal? So there's a lot of people out there doing one meal a day and either even meals a day. But how much can you actually consume within that time frame, right?
Yeah. And it comes that if you're only eating like 1,000 calories, it's literally impossible to hit the RDA of the micronutrients. But Kathleen has made a plan to how to eat a 1,500 calorie diet and hit all the micronutrients. But like, it's not like a normal diet. It's like, okay, you need 1 ounce of camel milk from imported from Egypt, and then you need to like fly a bison to like. It's very very difficult, and the average person will, the why you would want to eat a varied diet is just probably statistically, if you eat different foods on a different frequency, you're more likely to not become micronutrient deficient, right? Just because like you put all your hands in every basket, it's kind of like the stock market. You're probably not going to go to bankrupt, but if you put all your money on Apple and Apple tanks, you're toast. So the odds of you on a 1,500 calorie diet eating one meal a day hit all of your micronutrients is like zero, and that just means eventually you're probably going to run into some relatively not good health problems.
And yeah, underlooked thing is those micronutrients, right? I mean, how do you eat, Tyler? Like, what is your typical diet day to day, week to week? Like, I find mine, I eat a lot of the same things. And I always wonder sometimes if I should vary it from time to time. I do make sure that I just eat whole foods. I mean, we cook for ourselves all the time, and so it's healthy food. We're not eating processed things. But what is your routine like as far as eating on a daily? It probably depends. Are you doing cuts and bulks still?
Right now, I've spent the last year trying to build my maintenance. So I've just been very slowly adding about 50 calories a week, which has gone really well. So
Just like a few Skittles.
a few Skittles, those just like literally like a half glass of orange juice or things like that each week. And then I kind of like piecemeal it. So I'll add a little bit to breakfast. Then I'll finish a whole food. So it's a whole glass of orange juice, then add some fruit to lunch or something, and then
Hmm.
dinner. So I eat very similarly day to day. I change up dinner almost every day, or sometimes I'll meal prep because I'm busy and it takes a lot of time to cook for yourself. So breakfast is sourdough with some eggs, cheese, and throw some tomatoes, peppers, things like that in there real quick. Lunch is some Greek yogurt, a bunch of fruit, and I've actually been playing around with some cereals. I found that the not having any starches or fat in, just I was ravenous within like an hour or two.
Mm.
So having some starches seems to help with my satiety,
So
which
like potato starch, like as a cereal.
you could do something like that. I've just been doing like Raisin Bran. Raisin
Oh,
Bran's decent, and then they have like corn puff cereal that's all organic, like clean ingredients, and it tastes good. It makes my yogurt more enjoyable too.
interesting.
Yeah, I think we've gotten like pretty dogmatic. And this is me. I was not saying you or anyone, but me very much so, where it's like, okay, I only eat like these foods. And the more I restricted, the worse my gut health got. And I tried to eat other things, and all of a sudden my gut health was destroyed. So having some, I think, diversity in terms of the foods you eat is good. Now, again, I eat very consistently day to day, so I'm not the best person to do it, but I'm trying to branch off more and add some more foods back because at one my, the less foods I ate, I can remember when I was Pete or quote unquote peating, like fully hardcore, and I was eating the same thing every day, just a lot of milk and I guess
We eat
collagen and things like that.
raw milk or just regular?
I was doing raw milk,
Hmm.
and my gut health was just absolutely at its bottom.
Oh, really?
And
So
yeah,
you're not a big proponent of raw milk, or
oh
it
no,
just didn't
I
work
think
for
raw milk is
you?
fine.
Okay.
I think raw milk's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just whatever you digest better. I don't think it was the raw milk causing. I mean, I guess it could have been, but it was just like I had zero fiber, wasn't really eating much starches.
Okay.
I think also my gut health was probably wrecked just from college, and then I started trying to eat certain things. I didn't really spend the time healing it. But I think at the end of the day, like this is like I don't know if it's PD or not, but like having a decent amount of fiber seems the more fiber I seem to eat, better my gut health seems to get. A lot of it just in Dr. Pete's whole thing was perceive, think, act. So at the end of the day, I think people should do what they find works best for them.
Right.
What works best for them also will change over time. So a lot of people like I felt phenomenal doing intermittent fasting. But as you see with the space right now, a lot of people are running into issues with intermittent fasting. Peter T has said he hasn't gained any muscle in the last like 3 or 4 years, and he thinks fasting was a result of that. So as long as you get off the standard American diet, you're probably going to see some marginal or significant increases in your health, but where you end up long term might also change.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your lunch is like my breakfast. I usually do like Greek yogurt and blueberries, maybe a banana, and that's pretty much what I'll do for breakfast. And then and my issue is sometimes the middle of the day, what I like to do, because I don't want to have eggs like every day. I know eggs are great. Obviously, it's a great, you're getting plenty of nutrients, especially from the
Mhm.
yolk, healthy, good fats and things like that. But what do you think would be a good replacement for the middle of the day meal for someone that's maybe, not sure what to do?
Yeah. So I think just getting the issue we run into and what kind of makes it challenging is not going overboard in fat. So the way we calculate your grams of fat, where see people typically do best, is divide your weight by 2.2 to convert it into kilograms, and then multiply it by zero point 0.8 to get that's around where we see in terms of grams of fat where people do best. It's trying to manage that tends to be a little bit difficult. I think a lean source of protein with some carbs tends to be good. You could go like for like a burger with some cheese. He's like relative. I eat like 92.8 ground beef with kind of as lean as you can get. Chicken breast with like, rice, whatever, some broccoli. Generally a sandwich. I think we just trying to opt for leaner sources. Not that I think fattier cuts is great, but almost everyone has a ton of fat for dinner. So you don't really see a lot of people
Like
opt. And
like a ribeye.
yeah.
Although that
And I
would get
could,
expensive if you had a ribeye every night. But what do you? Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I've thought about like we usually pull out some type of protein for evening, and like for lunch, I'll do like sometimes cottage cheese with like fruit. But
mhm,
like it's very similar to my breakfast. I was like, yeah. So sometimes I'll do eggs and stuff, but sometimes you get sick of eggs.
yeah.
Um,
I've
and
got a pretty gnarly sourdough Greek yogurt pancake recipe. I can
ooh,
send you that.
that'd
It
be
actually
great.
hits your macros. Yeah, it's really good. It,
Sourdough, so it's homemade.
yeah, it's really easy though. Honestly, I mean, I guess it's all relative because if you bake nothing, it might not be that easy. But I don't find sourdough that hard. I think it's pretty
Okay, yeah,
easy.
send that to me. That'd be great. So sourdough pancakes.
Yeah, and they're really macro friendly. It's like 30 grams of protein, and they taste pretty good. Probably not winning any awards, but they get the job
Yeah,
done
that's
for me.
okay. I can eat most things.
Yeah,
Do you add in? Do you so occasionally have like liver or organ meats from time to time?
yeah. Added organ meats. I actually really like heart. Like if you, I would
I've had
probably opt
heart.
for yeah. Hearts taste like a steak if you do it right.
Yeah,
Maybe some people don't agree with that, but compare once you've eaten liver, anything is easy. I try to eat liver like at least once a month.
yeah, yeah. My wife is really good with cooking, so she makes like liver and onions,
Okay.
and it's like a little bit balsamic in there, and like the onions are so good that it like over so like if you don't really want to eat the liver, you get overpowers it a little bit. So it's like fine. I mean, I don't mind liver, but some people, think it tastes not great,
Yeah.
but
That's one where you need some butter on those onions for sure.
yeah, 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 exactly. Butter. She uses like some balsamic. I don't know, but I've been cooking in tallow, which has been great. I don't know if you cook in tallow, but it's a nice neutral source. And maybe touch on that. What are your thoughts around? I know everyone's talking about seed oils, as
Yeah.
like the detriment, and rightfully so. But there are people who are so like very anti seed oils, and there's other people that in the mainstream that think that it's a little bit overblown. What are your thoughts around it?
Yeah. I have probably pretty neutral take on this one. I do agree with seed oil side and I agree with the both saturated fat side. What we tend to see is people just eat way too much fat, and there tends to be consequences at too much fat, regardless of from saturated or not,
Hmm.
just because the there's the what's it called effect with the Randall effect where carbs and fat compete for one another to enter into the cell. So there was a tweet the other day that like sugar in your blood is or your brain is Alzheimer's, sugar in your blood is diabetes, and all that is true. Like sugar in excess does cause all of these diseases, but it also comes with fat, and they're competing for one another to entry. So it's more like a your arteries are getting clogged. There's a traffic jam in your in your highways, your arteries, and nothing can get into your cell. So I do think the polyunsaturated fats are an issue because they get lodged into your cells and they tend to peroxidize, which means that they have a double bond, which when a free radical, kind of like a car moving along the highway, the double bonds break, they cause a little collision. You need vitamin E to come in there and fix that collision. But a lot of times this will go around kind of like a pinball machine, hitting everything in sight, causing a lot of free radical oxidative damage in your cell. And ideally, you want everything to be as smooth as possible. Saturated fats don't have that double bond. So they're kind of like the pinball machine and you hit a perfect ball into the exit. Doesn't happen very often, but that's where you get all your points. And that is like your mitochondrial energy. So I think people that say saturated fat is really bad for you are correct because a lot of people are eating way too much fat in total. And there's really no sources of pure saturated fat, right? Because all steaks, I mean, tallow is pretty good. Coconut oil is really good, but I don't think those people are eating a ton of coconut oil by the tablespoon. They're eating steaks, which have a decent amount of PUFA too. So it's just fat in general. And then the seed oils, you can definitely go. I try to minimize seed oils as much as I can. But I think that if you get that number I gave before, where you divide your weight by 2.2 and multiply it by 0.8 to get like grams of fat, Ray Peat always recommended like 3 to 4 grams of omega-3 daily at the most. Or I think it may have been omega-6. If it's hard to do that without keeping your fat in moderation. So if you just keep your fat in moderation, you'll kind of appease both sides. You won't have too much fat, mostly saturated fat, and you'll get some PUFAs in general just because all saturated fat comes with PUFAs.
Yeah. So you find that fat overconsumption of fat, no matter what it is an issue with a lot of people you run into.
Yeah. I mean,
That's
I think if you
interesting.
go keto, you can kind of bypass that, but it's because you're taking out all the carbs.
Right. So I've had Brad Marshall on. You know Brad
Yeah.
Marshall? Yeah. Bright guy. Yeah. I got to get him back on because he was doing it. Now I'm drawing a blank on what kind of
The
type of
croissant
diet.
diet, right?
Yeah. Well,
Or,
he did the croissant diet, but he was doing, oh God, no. I have to look back in my notes because it was a while back. But brilliant guy. I think he's doing some work with Mercola right
yep,
now, and I love to get Mercola on actually.
that'd be cool.
That'd be cool. Yeah, I know. I just got his book and I'm reading it. I don't know if you have it. Sell Your
I don't
Health.
know.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's. I'm just starting it out, but he's sort of transitioned a little bit like a lot of these people from traditional keto ish to like more the Ray Peat and the pro-metabolic space. So his book is sort of talking about that. It's interesting. And I forgot where I was going with this, but
I was talking about keto and you brought up Brad Marshall with the lower fat.
yeah, that is something that like I think a lot of people don't actually track a lot, right? Like everyone talks about protein and carbs. Well, oh yeah, that's where I was going. Brad talked about that. So are you saying like, we talk about a mixed diet. Are you saying if you're going to have, and I think Brad might have alluded to this when I talked to him on the podcast, is that if you're having a higher carbohydrate meal, you should make sure that you keep those fats on the lower end because they're competing. Is that what you're alluding
I
to?
don't think, yeah, I mean, to a degree, yeah. I wouldn't, if you just keep your fats in moderation, period, like I don't
Yep.
think you inherently have to have like a high carb, low fat meal. But if you just like, I would probably spread your fats throughout the day because they seem to aid in digestion. They slow down digestion, which tends to avoid the blood sugar spike, what everyone's freaking out about these days. And they do a number of other things that they seem to all work best in conjunction. The issue is like your traditional French fries, where it's just like you have a ton of carbs and then just loaded in fat. And if you look at like that's probably your fat intake. You could go to McDonald's, have one meal, and that would probably be my fat intake like for the day, which is
Hmm.
like 60, 70 grams of fat. So yeah, there is like that competition, but also different tissues burn different things and at different rates. Like your liver, depending on how hungry you are, will absorb a lot of carbs. Your brain mostly runs on carbs. Muscles mostly run on fat at rest. So you have like I think Brad Marshall actually says it's like fats burned in the flame of glucose. Does that
Hmm.
sound right?
Yeah, yeah, Marshall. That's why when you said that, it made me think of him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's like you get this big spike, like, which is good. I think that's fine. And you get a ton of energy, and then the fat will sustain you until your next meal.
interesting. Okay. So, and like I know people who have, like we talked about, like it as sort of a warning is not to go crazy initially, right? Because I think some people who haven't had carbs in a while, they might be like, oh, okay, I'll add a bunch of carbs in, and then they just feel sluggish, and they're like, oh, I
Mm.
don't. Now I know why I didn't have carbs, but the reason is because your body's just not used to metabolizing glucose correctly, right? It's just so used to just using protein.
Yeah, that and I think actual digestive issues. So I think lactose is a great example where if you don't drink milk, you almost guaranteed will lose the ability to digest lactose. But if you want to add in lactose to your diet, they start with people that are allergic. It's 1/32 of a teaspoon,
Mm,
which if you like the picture of a teaspoon, it's literally like a needle. And I think almost everyone that's lactose intolerant could probably tolerate a 32nd of a teaspoon. And then you kind of just build in that. It's a lot easier said than done because I can't tell you how many people are, oh, like I can't eat that. And it's just like you can't eat that right now in the amount that you want to eat it, or the amount the rest of us have been eating it.
Right.
Like, I'm from Jersey, so we eat a ton of like gluten and pasta and things like that. And I don't think there's a lot of gluten intolerance around there because all of our guts have been slamming pizza and pasta our entire lives. But if you were to move there, you'd probably be like, oh, I can't eat. Like, I don't really do well with pizza. I don't do well with bagels and things like that.
Yeah. Carb sources, so what are your favorite carb sources? For me, when I started implementing more food into my life and sort of cut out a lot of the fasting, fruits was a big one, and some potato, some starches, rice, white rice, easy to digest, good source of carbohydrates. What are your favorite ones?
My favorite fruit is pineapple. I don't know if
Ooh,
it's a good one. Grilled pineapple, even better, possibly, but don't get
wow.
that too often.
Okay.
I do a ton of berries. Orange juice is my favorite by far. I love sourdough. I make my own sourdough, but I think you can get it store bought and it's pretty good. I think it comes to white rice, everything you said, potatoes. I struggled a lot with potatoes for a while. I think preparing your foods properly is really important. So I boil them and then I'll bake them to get them crispy, which is very extra for a lot of people, but it's kind of the
Ah,
way
do
I
you get them
found.
crispy? I've been trying to figure that out.
Yeah. So you can definitely get them crispy if you boil them, or so you can broil them too. I
Okay.
learned this recently that broiling is like a torch basically, so you only need to put them in for like five
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah, you'll burn them,
Yeah,
right?
I burn them every time.
So what I'll do is I'll get a potato or sweet potato. We'll slice it up, and then I'll put tallow on a pan, and
Mhm.
I'll cook it in. But I can't get them crispy, so I'm trying to figure. So you're saying we should boil them and then bake them, and it'll
Yeah,
become crispy?
you just put them in like at 400 for like an hour, and they'll definitely become crispy,
Okay. But you
especially if you
slice them.
have some
Do you
tallow on
slice them
there.
up? You slice
Yeah,
them up. Yeah, yeah. Thin
I,
slices. Yeah.
I
Or
usually just do like wedges, and they
okay.
still get pretty good, and you can flip them after half an hour. Potatoes are pretty resilient. It's kind of crazy because like you boil them and they're still in their shape, and then you bake them and they're just like you wouldn't know that you had boiled them previously. They're a little bit softer, but
Mm.
they're pretty good. It does take an hour and a half to boil them and then bake them though, so it is a bit of a time commitment.
Yeah, yeah. You got to be committed to that. I bought a rice maker, love it. It's been a great addition because we actually I get the sushi grade fish sent. I don't know if you heard of the company called Seatopia.
Yeah, I think you had them on, right?
Yeah, yeah. I had the owner on a while back, and they're still thriving. They're doing well, but they send out like farm raised fish, but that's farm raised in an environment species appropriate environment for these fish. So they're contained, but they're eating what they should be eating. It's interesting because then you're avoiding like the microplastics and all the things that can come out even from wild fish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great solution. Sounds like a really cool company too.
Yeah. Yeah, they've been. Yeah, I interviewed them years ago, and I still get stuff from them, and they seem like they've been growing. So I'm happy for him. I like to support companies like that.
Yeah, it's so ingenuitive and super cool.
Yeah, yeah. They got farms all over, the country, and the fish they send is just like sushi grade. Like literally, you don't have to cook it. It's like
Wow.
better than any like we go to sushi restaurants sometimes, and it's like I don't even like it. When you get it for yourself, it's like, and you start cooking for yourself, going out just doesn't compare.
Yeah, the more I cook for myself and learn to cook, the more I'm like, I don't really care to go out that much anymore.
Yeah, yeah, we're the same way. I wanted to talk about on your Instagram handle. You talked about testosterone booster tier
Yeah,
list. You remember putting that up?
I do.
Okay. I just wanted your thoughts on that. You sort of talk about like your S tier, which are like the big rocks that can maybe help with, boosting testosterone. And it looks like you got, meats and shellfish, working out, lifting weights, obviously, saturated fats, eating enough, and sleeping. I think that goes with no explanation needed for that, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then, getting sunlight is on the list, magnesium, boron, zinc, all good ways. Also carbohydrates you put in there as well. You think individuals, because you have some people who've really been on keto for a long time. I've had some people and they, I don't know if, obviously everyone's a little bit different, but they haven't had an effect necessarily on their testosterone, but like some people do have hormonal effects of not, eating clean carbohydrates for a while.
I think there's a big difference between being like optimized testosterone, I would guess, and maybe I'm wrong with what you've experienced, you're not seeing people with like the 1200, 1000 testosterone range on keto. I would guess you see them more in the middle of the range, and that's perfectly adequate for most people. But if you're trying to, that whole tier list was like, okay, I want to get my testosterone as high as possible, then I think you need some carbs just because the boys downstairs love the carbs. They thrive on glucose for the most part. And a lot of the first two tiers are just micronutrients that you need
Hmm.
that seem to be a lot of it's interesting too, because a lot of times like magnesium doesn't increase testosterone. Boron increases free testosterone, but it's mostly not having these things in your diet will impair your ability to produce testosterone.
And nutrient dense foods, you know, I've talked about it like we talk about the smash foods. You familiar with the smash foods like
I'm not.
oh, Brad Kearns has like a sort of a chart, but sardines, mackerel, anchovies, salmon, and herring. This is
Okay.
smash foods. So those are like wild caught, cold water fish. You got organs, liver, oysters is a big one. Ton of, micronutrients in oysters. A lot of people like them fried, but I would recommend not frying them.
Yeah. I feel like oysters are like the best part about oysters is the
They don't taste like anything, right? I
well
don't
that
even.
yeah, but the cocktail sauce is so good.
Oh, yeah. So just dose it with cocktail sauce and you're good to go, right?
Yeah. I heard Georgie say once that that's the cocktail sauce is so beneficial because it has some antibacterial effects. That's one of the
Mm,
reasons you can eat them raw.
interesting.
That's why they probably put lemon on too, because the antibacterial effects.
Yeah, oysters are great. Salmon roe, and then you go your sea level, which is like middle tiers, like red light. I've actually been utilizing red light quite a bit. What are your thoughts around red light? Is that something that you use?
Yeah, I use it intermittently. It's just kind of a pain for like you have to kind of like you can't really look at it. And some people say you can, but
You
y-
can.
yeah.
You
But it's
can.
like hard to like function while also looking at it. You know what I mean? Like you kind of have to just
Oh,
have like a red light. Like I'm gonna take 15 minutes and do red light. Like if I just have it at my desk, I'm just like blinded by the red light. You know?
I'll just from my experience, I've been doing it like literally every morning and night. You get
Mm,
used to it, and you can do stuff. You just, like it's amazing how your eyes adjust. I've watched shows before
mm,
doing red light, so you can make yourself do things. But that's just my experience. I don't know. Some people might be
yeah.
more sensitive to looking at it, but
No, I don't. I definitely believe it. I just have this little panel, and like if I had I would what I would probably do is I'd have like an infrared sauna, so I could just like go get my sauna and kind of do like two birds, one stone.
that's what I do.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
by all means, but like for me, it's just kind of a pain. I use a red night reading light. I think what's really important is not getting blue light in the eyes at night is really important, which also means red light. I think blue light blockers are okay. You just want to use them at night and possibly, I guess, in the morning. And at the end of the day, a red light is just like a full spectrum sun, which is go look at the sunrise and sunset if you can. There
Yeah.
does whenever I get injured, which happens more often than I'd like, I use red light. I think it can accelerate mitochondrial healing. Seems to just really have some pretty beneficial effects, and there's very little, if any, evidence that it's damaging.
Yeah. I mean, red light, I think, has been used for centuries. Like, I thought I read it something they tried to use it to grow plants on like the moon or, like it has some strong properties to it. Also potentially help with collagen production.
Mm.
I've heard that as well. Now your F's on the list there. One of them I do from time to time, which is cold plunge. I'm curious to know, living in Denver,
Yeah.
and then you got seed oils and then fish oil. So I know that like I don't take fish oils if I get, my omega-3s, I usually get it from food, but maybe touch on those. How come you put those on the F?
Yeah. So I would also possibly put saunas on the F, which I know, but I'm not.
Really?
So I don't know. This is where I'm very apprehensive towards it. I actually really like saunas for certain things. There's that guy, I forget, Lucas Aoun, who talks about icing your balls in the sauna because
Interesting.
the high heat seems to not do well for the oxidative stress. Now, the question is like for your sperm count, it saunas have been shown to have a negative effect on testosterone, or sorry, not testosterone, on sperm count.
Okay.
But the question is like, does that like you replenish the sperm every day? Like maybe it's not so good for today, but it's good for tomorrow.
Right.
The same thing. I think that area just tends to be very to because it's exposed. Either end of the extreme, I think, tends to be very stressful for the boys downstairs.
I usually
So
wear underwear when I'm in the sauna. So,
okay, maybe that was
and I
um
wonder if when you talk about saunas, like infrareds are different than just normal, like steam showers too, or steam saunas. So
Yeah, for sure. What temperature are you getting up to in like the infrared?
that's the thing. Sometimes I'll do like 105 and just
Yeah.
chill and not even almost sweat. But there's other times where I do want to get a sweat because I know that's a nice way to just sort of cleanse the body because obviously skin's your biggest organ, and so I'll get it up to like 120
Hmm.
ish
Yeah.
in that
I would
range.
think it'd probably be like more like 140 where you see like a lot of the detriments just
Okay.
because like, but it also depends how long you sit in there. And also like, here's the thing with all this, like there's a famous Thomas Sowell quote, there's no solutions, only trade-offs. So it's like, if you dump a pound of microplastics out from sauna every week, that's probably better for you than the acute possible decrease in testosterone production you might get from sitting in the sauna. Um,
Gotcha. Yeah.
the same thing with the cold plunge. A lot of sometimes there is some. I could be wrong on the cold plunge. I'm anti cold plunge mostly from the muscle growth effects, which seems to be pretty
Yeah.
that seems to pretty potently blunt muscle growth.
Yeah, yeah, and I've heard that as well. Like I try to use cold plunging like just really mindfully, right? Like I
Mhm.
only do it on days when I'm not lifting, and like the last thing you want to do is lift hard and then go do a cold plunge because then you're negating a lot of you're blunting
Yeah,
the effects of that muscle protein synthesis. But like I'll do it typically on a day when you got to feel like you got to want to do it, right? Like
yeah,
and I don't like abuse it and go and try to like set records in there. So I think it's all with a grain of salt a little bit when it comes to that stuff. I know some people are in the pro metabolic space are very anti cold plunge just because of the stress effect. I'm assuming that's why, right?
yeah. I think so. I mean, generally the whole pro-metabolic idea is let's raise body temperature, which is why you see a lot of people a fan of saunas, and I'm also a fan of sauna. Not to say it's not. I just don't think. I think if we're looking at acutely testosterone, there
Sure.
might be a negative effect, so I wouldn't put it in the possible list. But infrared sauna, maybe there is some possibility the red light increases it. So I think it's really we don't know enough. I think there is possibility there's benefits for cold plunges too. I just think generally that we do all these things to raise our core body temperature. So lowering it very intentionally probably is going to goes against the whole theory of pro metabolic.
And I also too I think like if someone is in a stressful state a lot, work is stressed, the home life is stressed, they probably shouldn't be doing a lot of plunging or doing things that are actually stressful to them. Like Brad Jay Feldman talks about like the stress bucket that like you have these things, someone cuts you off when you're driving and then you're, even more obviously working out can be a stressful activity and, maybe some your home life or work, all these things add up over time. And so I think if someone's in that type of stressful state from day to day, should they be doing more things that cause sort of a stressful situation or like jumping into a cold plunge? They might feel great initially, but it could take a toll over time. So like, everyone's a little bit different. I would say like for me, I'm not very I don't have a lot of stress. I'm very lucky for that. So if to do like something that's sort of like a cold plunge where I go in for a couple minutes, I think for me it's not a big deal. But for some people it might be especially if they have other stresses coming in.
Yeah. I mean, I always like to bring it back to the idea that the average American, they say it has $10,000 in the bank, is eating fast food multiple times a week, doesn't exercise, is 50 pounds overweight. So like you could cold plunge 5 times a day and would still, and if let's say theoretically it's horrible for you, you'd still be in a much better position because you eat at home with, saturated fats most of the time. You're eating whole foods. You're pretty intentional about covering your micronutrients. Like you were just so leaps and far ahead that it's hard for us to compare apples to apples there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the HUFAs, the highly unsaturated fats like the seed oils and the omega threes, just tend the your testes tend to be very prone to oxidative stress for whatever reason. Maybe that's because they're exposed. So I think when you get a lot of the highly unsaturated fatty acids, which are very prone to breaking apart, it tends to negatively affect there first compared to other regions.
Interesting. Okay. Well, this was great, Tyler. I feel like we could talk probably for another hour. I like to ask a few closing questions, but like, what's one thing you've changed your mind on? And you might have talked about it already, like from yourself, maybe 5, 10 years ago. What's one thing you've changed your mind on?
So I was very picky eater. Like ate my when I went to family's houses, it was like I needed to have one brand of chicken nuggets. It's and when I found the thermo diet, which is Christopher Walker's diet, I was so gung ho. Like vegetables are toxins, you don't need them. And now I'm actually trying to integrate more vegetables because I find the more fiber I have, the better my gut feels. Now, I'm
Mm.
not saying that's the case for everyone, but it seems to me that when I was at my point where I had almost zero fiber, I was doing the carrot salad, my gut was at its worst point. So I think having these, I think, same with saturated fat. You can take it to its extreme and you have a bowl of rabbit food and that's all you eat. Maybe your wife is probably the big onto the huge salads, like it looks like she's eating a bush kind of thing. And I don't mean to pick on anyone in particular, but just like a ton of leaves, definitely a detrimental. But having some fiber, like a small side salad with some of the bigger meals and that intentionally indigestible food seems to do well for a lot of people, including myself.
Okay, so you've sort of changed your mind about adding in some more fiber, mainly in the form of vegetables into
Yeah.
your life, whereas before you would totally avoid that.
Yeah. No broccoli, no anything. I was like, that is rabbit food. You should not be eating that. But I think having some fiber seems to really benefit me. And they actually don't taste bad when you cook them decently. I'm still
Right.
not good at that, but working on it.
And cooking it correctly is probably a big part of it too, right? As opposed to just eating it raw, especially
Yeah.
initially. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay.
And they
That's a
seem to have a ton of benefits for the microbiome and things like that too.
yeah.
A lot of what I end up finding is that a lot of both sides that are arguing like head to head, they're both right, and you just kind of got to figure out where that line in the middle is.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah, I think varieties is helpful, like for a healthy gut, right? If you can tolerate that, right? Some people get on carnivore and it's like the best thing, but they've come from a standard American diet, so they've eliminated seed oils and all these gut irritating foods. So they're going to feel great, but what can you do in the long term that's sustainable? And
Yeah,
that's where you can start hopefully adding back in foods and having a little bit more variety.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. And then last question is if you were going to give someone like one tip if they wanted to, let's say they've put on some weight, 15, 10, 15 years ago, they were leaner and felt better, but now they have a family, this and that, and sort of their health has been on the back burner. What one tip would you give that individual if they just were starting out to get back on that journey?
So it really depends the timeline that they're taking. I think the number one most powerful tool is to track, start measuring, which no one wants to hear. And even when I tracked, I didn't take it very seriously. But if you are looking at the foods that you're consuming, you can actually get a greater idea of what's going wrong. And what we tend to see with people, no one gains weight overnight. Like it's very, very rare. What
Hmm.
you tend to see is 3 to 5 pounds year over year. And luckily, it's not that hard to lose a lot of weight. But actually, here's my piece of advice. If you start tracking, you'll see your metabolism for a lot of people is on the very low end, like eating at 1,500 calories, 2,000 calories. I increased my metabolism from 3,000 to 4,000 last year. If you can do that systematically over time, maintain that for a little bit, and then go into a nice sizable cut, you'll probably be able to lose the weight, then reverse diet out and keep it off.
Yeah, and I think you talked to Kathleen about that, right?
Yeah.
So people are probably thinking, well, how did you raise your metabolic rate? Like, how are you measuring how you raise your metabolic rate? Are you measuring your temperature and pulse?
No, I think
Or
you can just, I mean, you can do that too, but you could also just measure it by how much you're eating. And then if you are eating this much and that increases and your weight stays here, then you have to inherently be burning more or moving more. But I can promise you I was not moving more. If anything, I was moving less.
so if you're at, let's say you start tracking, you're at 1,500 calories, right? Let's just say that's what you're eating, and you slowly increase that, but your weight stays the same. Hypothetically, you're
Those,
you're probably increasing your metabolic rate if you
yeah,
get your baseline up, right? But that takes time, right?
for sure. I was doing like 50 calories a week for 15, 20 weeks.
Okay. And now where are you at?
I'm right
3,000?
around 4,100.
That's a lot of food.
I want more. I'm hungry.
Look at you. You're a
uh,
machine.
apparently, it just took a lot of time, and I was at 3,000. But it was crazy because what was eye opening for me is Ashley, Kathleen, and I were all eating like the same amount, and I'm 6 foot, almost 200 pounds, and I was like, okay, well, this is just can't be right. And Kathleen's 5 foot nothing, 200, 100 pounds. So the fact that we were eating like 300 calorie difference is kind of mind boggling.
You know what? I might have to try to do that because I'm probably at, God, I haven't measured in a bit. I'm probably at about 2,000,
Yeah.
give or take,
And statistically, look, you eat at another 1,000 calories, the odds that you hit your micronutrient intake goes up, skyrockets, right? Just because you have more room for micronutrients.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. Well, this was awesome. I'm glad you came on, Tyler.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. And where's the best place for people to learn about you?
Yeah, I have my Instagram at Tyler Woodward _fit. And then I also have a podcast on YouTube and Spotify, Recommended Daily Value, which we're gonna get going soon. And maybe you'll come on there at some point.
Yeah, I love that. That would be great. Awesome. Well, yeah, I will put links in the show notes. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing all this knowledge about your life in pro-metabolic. So thank you.
Appreciate you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangryn.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.